Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Bigfoot tale. And today we're going to be talking about kind of a ghost story. The background to this story, and yes, it does kind of relate to a possible Bigfoot story, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The background of this story is it's centered in the Aroostook County area of Maine, and also over towards the what we call the Miramichi region of New Brunswick, Canada. And that area has a real extensive logging history, extending back for almost since the time of the founding of this new world by European settlers. And back during the early 1800s, um, there's a story afoot that talks about something called, the story has become to be known, Dungarvon's Whooper. And what this is, it's a ghost story, but it revolves around a young Irish cook of a lumber camp. His name was Ryan. And there's a river in the Miramichi region of New Brunswick called the Dungarvon River, which flows towards the Atlantic. And apparently, the guy was a real tightwad. He carried all of his money in a money belt. And one day when the lumber crews were out harvesting, Ryan and the boss of the camp was alone. And the boss decided to rob the young cook and murdered him. And when the crew came back, the boss told them that the cook had taken sick and died suddenly. They then buried the body some distance from the camp. Apparently, nobody questioned, what would have happened. Why would he have been taken sick so quickly? But at any rate, they buried him in the snow, quite a ways from this lumber camp. And that night, a whooping sound kept the group from falling asleep that night. The superstitious lumberjacks, all French Canadians, assumed that that was the ghost of Ryan crying out against the crime of which he was a victim. And of course, the men fled the camp the next morning, and they never would return to that area. And there's a bunch of different other extensions of this story that came from that happening. Whether it's a true one or not, I don't really know. It's quite that in part it is true. There are some newspaper clippings of various things going on. And first of all, we need to look at the superstitions of the area and to see how that could actually come about, and what this has to do with this possible Bigfoot tale that I'm going to relate to you towards the end of this session. It's a long story, but essentially everybody was tremendously afraid. Back then, the French Canadians were very superstitious. They were very religious, in one sense, but in another sense, they believed a lot of things that they didn't want to believe for various reasons. But I'm digressing here. But to get back to the regular story here. As this comes from the Miramichi region, it abuts the St. John's Valley, and many times the lumberjacks from Maine and Canada interchange their countries with absolutely no consideration for the borders. And in fact, in around 1840, that's we almost went to war with Great Britain, and this was part of the border disputes that we had, and military forces were actually sent to Holton and set up camp for the purposes of invading and defending against Great Britain. But Along about the late 1800s, I have a clipping from the Lewiston Journal, written by a gentleman by the name of Gilbert A. Russell. He titled the piece Dungarvon's Whooper. I don't know whether this extends from the story of Dungarvon's Whooper. Certainly sounds that it might be, but at any rate, we'll go over some of the details after, but I'll read the piece to you now. Hopefully you can put up with my narrations here for a while. But again, this was written back in the late 1800s. And he writes, and again, this is written by Gilbert A. Russell, but he writes, "What a man doesn't see nor hear, he doesn't exactly know to be true," says William Murray from way down in Aroostook County. But when a man hears a thing with his own ears, he's got a right to believe there's some truth in it. 20 years ago, William Murray was well known throughout Aroostook County as a hunter and a gummer. And just an aside here, for those of you that don't know what a gummer is back during the 1800s, there was a pretty heavy industry in collecting spruce gum to turn it into various products. And some of them made quite a bit of money at it. So a lot of people who were professional hunters also went out gumming, as they called it. But to get back to the story, he has had much experience in untangling stories of hairbreadth escapes in the deep woods. Mr. Murray tells the following story of Dungarvon's Whooper that was for many years the dread of every hunter, which operated in the vicinity of Dungarvon Lake. And this is apparently Mr. Murray narrating the story here. From here on out, "I'm not the only man who's heard Dungarvon's whooper whooping out them unearthly screams of his," says William Murray, "and I know of a dozen men who's hunted and gummed around Dungarvon Lake that will tell you the same story today. Whether it's old Dungarvon's ghost, an Indian devil, or the real devil himself, I can't say, for I never saw him, but I've heard him with my own ears, and that's enough to satisfy me that it's no nightmare that I've been indulging in." It was in the fall of 1852, and as bright an October morning as ever dawned on the St. John River. I started out with a fellow from New York to give him a week's hunting and a gummin'. He wanted to go where there was plenty of big game and a good gummin', so I selected Dungarvon Lake, knowing well that what was there. I was stopping that fall down at St. John, and that's where I ran across the fellow. We pulled 2 days up the St. John River, and from there into the lake we had to pack our outfit on our backs. It was a long, hard day's tramp, but the fellow didn't complain any till toward night. He gave up and declared in a very few words that he wouldn't go no farther that day. We had struck the outlet when the fellow gave up, and I knowed we wasn't more than a mile from the lake. I allowed him to rest a spell, and then I packed half his load on my back and coaxed him along a little ways at a time, till I got him to the lake. It was 2 miles across the head of the lake to where I knowed there was an old set of lumber camps. After we had stumbled up and down the shore for half an hour, mind you, it was pitch dark and I couldn't see 2 feet in front of me, I came across an old dugout that I had left turned up on the shore a month before that time. "What are you going to do with that thing?" says the fellow when I tipped the boat right side up and asked him to help me shove it from shore. "Going across the lake in it," says I. "You don't want to lay out in the woods all night, do you?" And he snapped back at me as if he had made up his mind not to let me coax him any further that night. "Lay out or stand out, I'll never get into that thing," he replied, rather short, balking up right then and there. I told him about the old camps, and told him what a fine place it would be to camp for the night, ending up by telling him that we would be pretty liable to have a moose or bear walk over us before morning if we laid out. And after considerable coaxing, I got him harnessed into the boat, with me hold of the paddle. The lake was as quiet as the night itself, and the moon didn't rise till past midnight, so we could look for no help from that to light us across to the other shore. The boat was sliding along as smooth as grease, and the fellow seemed to be enjoying himself immensely till we got within about 40 rods of the west shore. when there come the most unearthly howl out of the woods. It floated out on the lake to greet us. It come from the vicinity of the camps, and I never heard the critter let out with quite so much vim as he did that night. It was just a long, lingering howl that ended with a sharp cry, like someone calling for help. Boys, if you ever saw a fellow crawl into his shirt collar, you ought to have seen that fellow for about a half a minute. Then he made a drive for his rifle that lay in the bottom of the boat, and I thought sure he would capsize us both before I could get him quieted down enough to reason with him. Help, help, come from the camp, or so it seemed, as that was what it was saying, and that fellow trembled so the boat shook from bow to stern. I couldn't see whether he was black or white, but he was so scared he couldn't speak for 2 minutes. Scared? Well, I didn't feel very homelike for a few minutes myself. I didn't feel in any particular hurry about rushing to the rescue. I had heard the noise before, but never so doleful as that night. There's someone being murdered in the camp, says the fellow, when he was able to speak. For God's sake, let's go and help him. There's nobody there, says I. This same noise has been heard by different ones for the past 20 years. Don't care what you've heard. There's someone in them camps being murdered, he chucked back at me. Just then, a howl broke from the woods that made me hang back in the rigging. It ended in about the same way as the first one did, and I was no ways anxious to hear it repeated. The fellow seized a paddle that lay in the bottom of the boat and plunged it into the water to his elbows, nearly spilling us both into the dark. Let up a bit, I ordered. I know more about this business than you, and I know there's no one in the camps. He cooled off some, and when he got down to about normal, I told him the story of Dungarvon's whooper, as I have heard my grandfather tell it over again. It's been a long time since I've told the story, but if you fellows don't mind, I'll tell it, and as I told it that night, a-settin' on the lake, kind of waiting for the whooper to settle down for the night's rest before we went ashore. Whenever I hear the name of Dungarvon's whooper mentioned, the story comes back to me as fresh as it was 40 years ago, when I used to sit in front of the fireplace and hear my grandfather tell it. There was a man by the name of Davenport from St. John who went with a crew of 20 men to this lake to operate for the Giberson brothers. He was to get so much per thousand for lumber landed on the lake. He took a scaler along with him by the name of Isaac Dungarvon, and the Gibersons sent up a Spaniard to scale and look after their end of the business. The Spaniard and Dungarvon never got along well together. They were always in a row whenever they come to comparing accounts of the logs. The Spaniard was an able man, and Dungarvon was not the man to take a back seat when he was thought right. The scalers used to be in the camp a great deal of the time when they were waiting for the teams to come up to the landing, and that was when they'd done most of their rowing. The cook stood in with Dungarvon, and it seemed that the Spaniard was a little shy of him. Well, to make a long story short, one night when the crew was coming to camp, they heard what they took to be Dungarvon screaming for help and shouting murder. The men knew about how things stood between the scalers, and they come to the conclusion that they were having a settlement that was ending in the death of Dungarvon. The men rushed for the camp, and when they got inside, there was no lights, and not a sound could they hear. They lighted some lanterns and looked around the men's part of the camp, expecting to find Dungarvon's body on the floor. From there, they rushed to the cook room, then to the cattle hovel, and searched. But no trace of Dungarvon, the cook, nor the Spaniard could they find. On making a second search, they found blood spots on the deacon's seat in the men's room, and the same on the floor of the cook room. There was no snow on the ground then, so there was no way of tracking the 3 men wherever they went. The crew kept up the search till morning, but no clue could they find to aid in the search. The clothes were not taken from the camp, and that made it look all the more suspicious that there was foul play somewhere. My grandfather said, he being one of the crew, that they were about evenly divided in opinions. Some thought that the cook in Dungarvon had murdered the Spaniard, and fearing that they couldn't give a satisfactory account of him, they had left the woods. Others held that the Spaniard had come in on the cook unawares and murdered him. Then a duel took place between him and Dungarvon, being as it was Dungarvon's voice that was calling for help. It seems that the latter opinion was the way that it happened, and ever since that time the lake took the name Dungarvon's Lake. The next day, the boss sent a man out to St. John to learn if either of the three men had been seen there, but he came back with no news. There happened to be a man on the crew who could cook, and the boss put in another scaler, and business went on as before. Just a week from that night, long about 3 o'clock in the morning, there was the greatest commotion that ever took place in the crew of men. Everything was still in the camp except the snoring and heavy breathing of men, when all at once someone screamed, "Murder!" It was Dungarvon. There was no mistaking his voice. There seemed to be a conflict between two men on the floor. Dungarvon was calling for help, and a Spaniard could plainly be heard to mutter curses on the other between heavy blows, as if he was using some sort of weapon. Every man in the crew piled out of his berth. Some seized axes, others cant dogs to defend themselves, but when the lights were turned up, there was no one in the camp in the form of Dungarvon nor the Spaniard. The mystery deepened, and not a man went to bed again that night. It was the whole talk of the crew, and when the days rolled around and the night came that registered another week, the same thing took place again. The next morning the crew, every man of them, gave his notice and started for the St. John. No amount of persuasion on the boss's part could induce them to spend another night in that camp. Well, boys, when I had finished telling the story, that fellow was speechless. I thought at first that he had gone off on the handles altogether, but when I asked him if he was willing to risk his skin in the camp that night, he surprised me by saying that he did. A few strokes of the paddle brought us to the shore, and I lighted a lantern that we carried with us. When I pushed open the camp door, it tumbled from its hinges. There was the old camp, just as the crew had left it. Mind you, I'd never ventured inside the camp before. The berths had rotted to the floor, and the old stove had toppled to one side. The roof had fallen in places, but the most of it hung to the walls that seemed comparatively solid. I don't believe there's been another man stayed overnight in them camps, except that New Yorker and me since Davenport's crew left it. Whatever became of the three men, nobody never knew, but this is the true story of Dungarvon's Whooper, as been told and believed by 3 generations. And this is an old story, and again, there's a lot of superstitions from the old logging crews. And there's a lot of strange things that have happened in the woods of this northeastern continent over the last hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's quite possible, and again, this is a stretch here, and this is a tale after all, a Bigfoot tale. It's quite possible that what actually happened was, for whatever reason, there may have been an altercation at this camp, and I have found other old newspaper clippings and references in history books of various communities of strange things happening in the dark of the night at various lumber camps around the northern woods. We call them the Great Woods for a reason, and that's because they are so big and vast. It's entirely possible that there are a clan of these creatures living there. But it's quite possible, and again we have no way of proving this, that the origins of this story may have actually come from an encounter between a creature such as Bigfoot, who is known to make sounds, as has been described in this story and other ghost stories concerning Dungarvon's Whooper, or Dungarvon's Whooper, whichever way you want to put it. Again, it's quite possible that there was some sort of a confrontation and altercation. Perhaps the Bigfoot was hungry and wanted something to eat. We have a lot of superstitions and tales and stories going back in history of the potential of what we call a Wendigo being a cannibal and eating men. And this frightened many loggers in the early days. And I'm not going to have enough time today, but in upcoming episodes of Bigfoot Tales, we'll go over some of the old stories and look at the references and relationship between many of these old stories to today's Bigfoot sightings. But the doleful howl is very much like we have heard in other YouTube videos and sound recordings floating around the web today. Many people consider them to be authentic recordings of a Bigfoot. Whether they are or not, I can't prove that they are. I believe that at least some of them are correct and true. And again, there's no way we can, determine that for true unless we can somehow capture and observe in a scientific fashion this Bigfoot. But it's quite possible that this tale actually was founded upon an altercation or of Bigfoot and these three employees of this lumber camp. And again, I don't have enough time to go into more details, unfortunately. It's actually something that could probably go on for hours and hours and hours discussing a bunch of different things here. But Dungarvon's Whooper. It's a ghost story from the St. Johns Valley, northeastern Aroostook County, and the Miramichi region is rich in these stories. And I found several of them that, like I said, could actually have found their original meaning and story in a contact between mankind and these Bigfoot creatures. One of the things that I've learned about folklore is that almost all fictitious stories have a founding and a factual happening. And as we go through Bigfoot tales here, we'll get into more detail of the folklore of this creature and the northeastern United States and many of the stories that I've come across. And again, I'll leave you with the fact that, or the opinion that, I believe it quite likely that this was actually an altercation between a Bigfoot and these lumber camp employees, and it's quite likely that either the Bigfoot scared them off and they took off a-running and never looked back, or it's quite possible that this Bigfoot, if indeed that's what it was, took possession of these three men, if you want to call it that to be polite. We'll never know, of course. This actual story actually comes from somewhere around the 1830s or so. And I'll leave you with that today. And make sure you comment, rate, and subscribe. And keep coming back for more Bigfoot Tales here on the Bigfoot Tales channel. And I'll see you next time. Have a good day. And